But okay, so passage for this coming Sunday is Genesis chapter 1 to 2:4, which is an odd break, but we'll explain why that makes sense. This is the lectionary that's been assigned, so we're not just picking this out of nowhere, although couldn't have picked a better one myself. It's Trinity Sunday, which is usually a celebration of the Trinity, but the gospel passage is kind of weak, so we're actually focusing on the Hebrew Testament instead, and kind of, even though it's still called Trinity Sunday, kind of not going to really pay attention to that very much. Anyway, so we get to talk about Genesis 1, chapter 1, and it's creating a creation story. This is going to be talking about how this story came to be and how that informs what it means for us. Okay, so this is the text. You can read off the screen if you want. If it's really small for you, as it is for a lot of people, including myself, use the Bible that's in your lap. But can we have a first reader for the first day, and we'll just finish up through the 7 days. Or I will begin. When God began to create heaven and the earth then was welter and waste and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovering over the waters, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness God called night. And it was evening, and it was morning, first day.
And God said, "Let there be a vault in the midst of the waters, and let it divide water from water." And God made the vault, and it divided the water beneath the vault from the water above the vault. And so it was. And God called the vault heavens. And it was the evening, and it was the morning, second day.
And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered in one place, so that the dry land will appear." And so it was. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of waters God called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth grow grass, plants yielding seed of each kind, and trees bearing fruit of each kind that has its seed within it." And so it was. And the earth put forth grass, plants yielding seed of each kind, and trees bearing fruit that has its seed within it of each kind. And God saw that it was good, and it was evening, and it was morning, third day.
And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and they shall be signs for the fixed times and for days and years, and they shall be lights in the vault of the heavens to light up the earth." And so it was. And God made the two great lights, and the great light for dominion of day, and the small light for dominion of night, and the stars. And God placed them in the vault of the heavens to light up the earth, and to have dominion over day and night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And it was evening, and it was morning, fourth day.
And God said, "Let the waters swarm with the swarm of living creatures, and let fowl fly over the earth across the vault of the heavens." And God created the great sea monsters, and every living creature that crawls, which the water had swarmed forth of each kind, and the winged fowl of each kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the water in the seas, and let the fowl multiply in the earth." And it was evening, and it was morning, fifth day.
And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of each kind, cattle and crawling things and wild beasts of each kind." And so it was. And God made the wild beasts of each kind, and the cattle of every kind, and crawling things on the ground of each kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let us make a human in our image, by our likeness, to hold sway over the fish of the sea, and the fowl of the heavens, and the cattle and the wild beasts, and all the crawling things that crawl upon the earth." And God created human in God's image. In the image of God, God created him. Male and female, God created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and conquer it, and hold sway over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the heavens, and every beast that crawls upon the earth." And God said, "Look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the face of all the earth, and every tree that has fruit-bearing seed. Yours they will be for food, and to the beasts of the earth, and to all the fowl of the heavens, and to all that crawls on the earth, which has the breath of life within it, green plants for food. And so it was, and God saw all that God had done, and look, it was very good, and it was evening, and it was morning, the sixth day.
Then the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their array. And God completed on the seventh day the work God had done. And God ceased on the seventh day from all the work God had done. And God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it. For on it, God had ceased from all God's work that God had done. This is the tale of the heavens and the earth when they were created.
Thank you so much, everyone. And that concludes also your requirement to really pay attention. So I just wanted to note that this is the translation from Robert Alter in this book. I should also probably cite my sources. Today's really heavily depends on a lot of scholarship. There's Conrad Leroux's Book of Genesis from Adam and Eve to the Tower of Babel. It's about 50 years old. There's Myth Making in the Biblical Tradition, Slaying the Dragon from Bernard Bato. It's about 40 years old. There is The Genesis of Perfection, Carl Anderson. It's actually only about 10 years old. Bible Unearthed, Archaeology by Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman. This is from the early 2000s. Also used Walter Brueggemann's Interpretation Genesis commentary. This is about 40 years old. And also Klaus Westermann's Genesis 1 through 11 commentary. And this is about 50 years old. So the thing to note is that a lot of scholarship about Genesis is really old. And that's going to show. So for example, this translation, Robert Alter, which kind of is the best at capturing the poetry of the original, still had to be changed for pronouns. And so we tried to make sure that God was at least pronounced with God, even though some of the other pronouns are a little bit problematic. So I apologize for that, but that's how it is. Okay, so this is the overview for tonight. What and how does it mean? So that's the same question that we had for the last 3 of these. This is a controversial passage. This has led to people being very angry that, they come from monkeys. It has definitely isolated Christianity. It has made us laughing stocks in some ways. So I think being really careful with it can be a really, really wonderful way for us to be able to talk with people that are skeptical about Christians being really crazy and stupid. So let's be a little bit more careful about this. So let's start with where we were back in Matthew, back in January. So we asked some really basic questions about the passage to be able to explain its meaning. So we asked who wrote this, when was it written, where was it written, and why was it written? And that gave us a lot of insights. But when we get to a passage like Genesis, especially Genesis chapter 1, things sort of break down, because if we try to ask who, the traditional answer is either Moses or God's self, when maybe at the beginning of time. Where was it written? I don't know, maybe the throne of God, heaven. Where else, did someone have the advantage point of recording this history? Why was it written? As a record of the history of all reality. The question of what do you do with that is pretty fair. So these things that we ask give us context, and this Genesis passage in some ways promises to be so universal that maybe it defines its own context. It is context itself. If you take it literally, or if we believe what we've been told about this, as opposed to looking at the text itself. So we're going to go past that because we can't understand the mind of God. And that's really not ours. If we believe that Moses wrote Genesis and that this is a factual account of history for us today, then that's not text analysis. That's not knowing something. That's just believing doctrine. It's because someone else told us this, but it's not actually looking at the passage itself and asking ourselves, what do we see here? And that's always the more interesting question, because that's personal, that's relevant to us, as opposed to, the vulnerabilities of believing what someone else told us to believe, because they always have their own agenda. The thing to know about this, though, is that this is political text. This is not just a description. And it's not provably true. It's something that we conjecture over and theorize over. So I don't mean to say that anything I say tonight is fact or provable. What it is as much as the reality of all of our lives, which is belief. It is faith. It's something that's informed by our experience. It's something that feels true rather than proves true. And that's really what's more important and interesting about it, I think. Because that's ultimately what brings us closer to God. And only believing things that we were told by other people, that actually takes us farther than God, from God. So, let's remember that kind of really important dictum from Augustine, that a good interpretation of a text is that which brings us to a closer love of God and others and ourselves. And so really kind of looking at this, rather than looking at a belief about Genesis 1 and the story of creation, is hopefully going to be the better interpretation because it brings us closer to God. It might be shocking that truth and doctrine are different things. I understand that for some of us, we haven't been really taught that. But as Christians, we should think with some humility that there are a long list of places where the Christian church, in its attempt to project the image of being all-knowing in matters outside of its realm, has made it a matter of doctrine to talk about things like the sun revolving around the moon, around the earth, rather than the earth revolving around the sun, or selling of indulgences, or the infallibility of the Pope. None of these things are actually in the Bible. So it might seem to be an exaggeration of the interpretation of Genesis 1, but to believe that this is the actual history of the world is not necessarily what this text even sets out to be. It's a belief about this text that came afterwards. And that was really justified by people in the church that found that people who thought were very dangerous. And so rather than allowing them to think, we told people what to believe, and we punished them if they didn't do that. So let's think about this instead. One of the first kind of tools for us, let's get some vocabulary down. So we're going to talk about these words that might seem unfamiliar to you. We're going to talk about Torah and Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is really just a way of talking about penta, 5, like pentagon. The first 5 books of the Bible, which is a Greek way of talking about what a Jewish person might call Torah, which translates as law, but is actually a much larger idea than just law. So it is the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Sometimes you'll hear a tetratuch being talked about instead, and that is just Genesis through Numbers, excluding Deuteronomy. You'll also sometimes hear about a hexatuch, and that would be Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and anyone can guess. If you remember, had to memorize this to be able to earn candy in Sunday school, it would be the next book of the Bible, Joshua, which really kind of closely follows or continues the narrative of Deuteronomy. So that would be the hexatuch. Important thing to note here is that we think of books as being these things with 2 covers that have a single author, that have a single intention, that have a copyright date, that are protected, that can't be added to without kind of changing the book. But that these things were actually written on scrolls. And scrolls are a reminder that scrolls are, at least in the ancient Near East, could be cut apart. They were letters, they were diaries, they were poems, they could be stitched together. And so the idea that these books are static in time, that they couldn't change, is really to not understand the way that texts were recorded a long time ago. And that's important for us. Just a second. So we're going to do some background again and look at a timeline of the actual things that we can prove with archaeology. So nothing here is, I would be able to stand up in any really good graduate program, not like one of those kind of crazy seminaries, but an actual scholastic program, and talk about these events happening in history. And this is attested to with corroborated archaeology, essentially. So like, we have other records from other cultures that are mentioning these events. We have actual solid evidence. So really the history of Israel does not go back as nearly as far as we think. It certainly doesn't go back to the creation of the world. Really about 1250 to 1000 BCE is when we see the emergence of a culture that can be recognized and associated with the modern or with the narrative that we have in the text, the highlands of Canaan. There are previous people inhabiting these lands. It has a long uninterrupted history of habitation, but they are not recognizably Hebrew in character of the cultic religion and people group. So there are things that we're going to skip in the history. So things like the Davidic kingdom, not terribly proven. It's conjectural that David was a monarch. The Exodus, the exit from Egypt, something that probably should have left some record if it was, if it occurred in Egypt, which is, known for recording things very well. Not really attested to in the archaeological record. The flood, maybe not so much. Things like that. The Tower of Babylon, no, certainly not. That's not going to show up on our timeline. The next big date is the division of the kingdom of what would have been the unified kingdom under the Davidic and Solomonic line into two kingdoms. In the north, it's called Israel, and in the south, it's called Judah. The northern kingdom is conquered first in 722. The capital city of Samaria is destroyed, and the Assyrians take the population away. In that period, so from the construction of a temple until 597, this is all referred to as the first temple period. And we think that temple was historic, and located in the south. The southern kingdom goes through a period of waning and increasing influence. One of the important kings is King Josiah, who has this kind of remarkable story that during Josiah's reign, there are known to be multiple centers of worship. So there are altars, set up throughout the Genesis and the Joshua narrative in many different places where God does something significant. So there are different places you can worship God, just like there being many different churches or different cathedrals. And that is good for people to be able to access local worship. It's bad for centralized power if, just one temple wants to be the big deal. So in 621, Josiah, and we think that this is historic, Josiah goes into the temple, or under Josiah's reign, a book of the law is discovered. And we think that that's mainly the book of Deuteronomy. And it asserts one place of worship. And so it leads to the destruction of all the altars in other places. And it's really good as an economic and political move because it centralizes power in the Jerusalem temple. And, you don't just go and discover the book of Deuteronomy, right? If it was really important, this isn't some archaeological dig. What we think actually happened was that the book of Deuteronomy was written at this point as a way to justify the centralization of political power. After that, in 597 to 586, there are successive waves of destruction from Babylon. So first, the king is deported with all the aristocracy of the southern kingdom, is taken away as captives to Babylon, and then Babylon comes back and takes away everyone else. And so this is the beginning of the Babylonian exile, which is probably, in terms of the formation of our scriptures, the most important thing. Two things, right? The story of the Exodus is certainly the most crucial thing to understand the monotheistic God, the understanding of the revelation of Sinai, but it's not historic. The thing that is historic that's really important is the exilic period. So this is where the temple is destroyed and the population is carried off to Babylon. It's a time of great suffering and great questioning of God. That period ends in 539 because Babylon itself is conquered by Cyrus of Persia, who releases the Israelite people to go back to Judah and rebuild their temple, which happens in 520 to 515, and this becomes the second temple period. The second temple is destroyed in the Common Era, in the first century of the Common Era, after a revolt that leads the Roman Empire to destroy it. And that is the end of the Second Temple period. But we're just looking at the Hebrew scriptures here. So this whole period ends in 63 BCE when the Roman Empire conquers Jerusalem and Judah becomes a client state of the Roman Empire. So just some things this is what we can actually talk about as historical. Other things I don't have any interest, or neither should any of us have any interest of treating them as historical fact. This is as best as we can get to. Okay, so there are problems. For example, it was noticed the idea of the first 5 books at the very least being written by God or Moses, recording all of the documented is really problematic because it just simply doesn't hold up to the text. The first kind of attempts to notice that there were problems in the first 5 books were really modest, and of course comes only with liberalization of thought starting maybe in the medieval era. So the first note was very kind of modest. It was that in Genesis 12 verse 6, the verse says that Canaanites were then in the land, and it was noticed by a commentator, well, if Canaanites were then in the land, there must have been a time when this was no longer the case. And so maybe this part of Genesis was written after when Canaanites were in the land. So, so just some like that this was not all written at one time in history. Kind of that thought expanded. Genesis 36:31 has a problem as well, because it says that kings who reigned in Edom before any kings reigned over the Israelites, meant that maybe that passage was written after there was a monarchy established in Israel, because it mentions kings reigned over the Israelites, and that would have been unknown to any contemporaneous writer of Genesis 36. Other things that were problematic, if the beginning of Deuteronomy notes that this is a book written by Moses, but the end of Deuteronomy includes the death, and it was observed that maybe it would be very hard for Moses to write about his own death. That could be problematic. So questions. Then during the Reformation, kind of these problems multiplied, or the noting of these problems. So repetitions and contradictions were first kind of talked about. And they suggest that there might have been more than one author when the same passage shows up in multiple places, or that there are contradictory, like factual contradictions. So maybe more than one person wrote this, and that's how you could have, different facts. So Genesis 1, for example, is reproduced in Genesis 2. So the creation story repeats itself. The flood story in Genesis 6 to 9 is kind of repeated as well. There are 2 flood stories in Genesis 6 to 9. Abraham identifies Sarah as his sister to a foreign king twice in Genesis 12 and 20, and then Isaac identifies his wife as his sister in chapter 26. The covenant with Abraham happens twice, Genesis 15 and 17. Hagar and Ishmael being cast into the desert, that story happens twice in Genesis 16 and 21. Beersheba is named twice in Genesis 21 and 26. There are 2 different variants of the crossing of the Red Sea in Exodus 14 and 15. The mountain where Moses receives the revelation that we call the 10 Commandments is either called Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, and those are 2 very different mountains. So those are factually irreconcilable. The 10 Commandments, there are 3 sets of the 10 Commandments. The list of forbidden animals occurs twice in Deuteronomy 14 and 11. So the list goes on. There's actually quite a number of these. And then, you have the Enlightenment. And so like Thomas Hobbes in 1651 says that maybe people shouldn't believe what they're told about the Bible, but should actually look at the text itself to know what to believe. Or Spinoza in 1670 begins to suggest that maybe all of the books of the Bible up into Kings were actually written by Ezra after the Babylonian exile. But really kind of the first big thing that happens to really get to our modern state of understanding these first 5 books is in 1735, a physician, Jean Astruc, royal physician to the French court, notes that there are different names used for God, and that's really puzzling. And you might think, well, maybe they just had different names for God, and they switch between them. But it actually becomes factually impossible because, for example, in Exodus chapter 6, it says that God also spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord, appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but my name is Yahweh. I did not make myself known to them, and which I did not make myself known to them. So for the example, so essentially in Exodus, for the first time, God is being introduced as Yahweh, except Yahweh is used as the name of God in many places before Exodus. So maybe that one verse of Exodus is coming from a different author than the authors that used Yahweh as the name of God before. And then in Genesis 4:26, we see that the verse says, to Seth also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. At that time, people began to invoke the name of Yahweh. So, we have directly that Yahweh begins to be used in Genesis 4, but then somehow God says later on in Exodus 6 that only now I have introduced myself as Yahweh. So these two things cannot happen together. So it's kind of a question, how do we reconcile this? Like, what does this mean? This is the dominant theory that exists today, and it's still called a hypothesis because it's not something that's provable. It's just our best way to understand. The first 5 books of the Bible essentially were written by different authors who each had a different idea of what was important and a different viewpoint, a different political agenda. We think that the oldest strands were what we call the J and the E authors. I'll explain what these all mean. And these were combined to a JE text that was then worked upon by a P text, a priestly text. And separately, there was a Deuteronomist that was added as well. And all 4 of these got combined to the JEPD, which is now what we have today. So essentially, when we read the first 5 books of the Bible, we are reading a stitched together patchwork of at least 4 original texts. And that's why they sometimes contradict each other and sometimes they repeat. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't believe any of this stuff or that it's somehow not worth it. It just means that we should have a little bit more reverence to what it actually is. And so a great kind of example of this, I just put this slide, this information here to be referenced later on, is the Noah story, which from chapter 6 to 9 is actually 2 different texts woven together. Because when you actually read Noah chapter 6 through 9 to get all through, straight through, it doesn't make any sense. It just repeats itself over and over and over again, and it contradicts itself until you realize that there are 2 different documents here and you separate them. So if you were to read, for example, continuously Genesis 6, 5 through 8, and then skip directly to 7, 1 through 5, 16b through 23, like the J document together, then you can reconstruct the original Yahwist text of Noah's story and contrast that with the priestly text that is interwoven, and that is these other texts here. And then that actually makes sense. You have 2 continuous narratives. So this was kind of a big discovery, and it's been out there for about 120 years. I don't know why it's not more commonly understood, but this is what it is. Okay, so we have these 4, maybe 5 different authors. And so just as an illustration, Genesis is a mix of many of them. Exodus, also Yahwist and priestly. Leviticus is mainly priestly. Deuteronomy is mainly Deuteronomist. Let's talk about what that means. So because this was done by German scholars, the Yahwist, you spell Yahweh with a J in German. So that's why we call the Yahwist author a J author. And we're pretty sure that this was one author because it's really, really consistent in terms of its language and its unity. It's named after the characteristic way of referring to the deity within the Yahwist text by Yahweh, the Yod, He, Vav, Yod. Whereas the other 3 authors, E, P, and D, refer to the text, refer to God as Elohim. So Yahweh is the proper name for God, unique to the Israelite Hebrew religion, whereas Elohim is kind of just the word God itself and could be used to refer to other gods. So characteristics of the Yahwist author, it exhibits a certain bias and prejudice that's really consistent with the southern kingdom, Judah. So we suspect that the writer was a member of that community. So writing sometime after the split of the 2 kingdoms, and this is why the timeline was important, and before the fall of the northern kingdom in 722, because once the northern kingdom is gone, you don't really have to say really horrible things about them. They really kind of pity them. So the fact that the J author kind of seems to really look down on the northern kingdom means that it was probably during the period that the northern kingdom existed in 722. It has been suggested that more specifically that the J author was a propagandist for the legitimacy of the Davidic line over the house of Saul. So after the transition of power happens from Saul to David, that it has to be justified. Why is David the legitimate king? And so the Yahwist author oftentimes takes David's side. And also, why should Solomon have inherited the throne over his older brothers? So we think that maybe more specifically, it could have also been that the Yahwist author was writing from Solomon's court. We don't know exactly what, but this is, that's what scholarship is. There's an argument about it. And one of the other features is that it rejects your Egyptian centralized political structure in favor of a more Bedouin value of economic independence and autonomy. Jay's stories include the Garden of Eden, Cain and Abel, Lamech, the flood, part of the flood narrative, the drunkenness of Noah, Tower of Babel, the calling of Abraham. Jay was influenced by Gilgamesh and adapted the Atrahasis myths from the Mesopotamian traditions. We're going to get to what that means in just a second. J is really colorful and folksy. The prominent theme for J is promise and fulfillment. And J is often attractive to Christian theologians because it often thinks of, Christianity thinks of itself as the fulfillment of Hebrew Testament promises. So the idea of promise and fulfillment appeals to Christianity. By the way, that's really problematic because it's really kind of a bad idea to think of Christianity as being the fulfillment of Hebrew scriptures and the Jewish religion, which is a totally separate and independent and fully formed religion on its own. Just remember that. The E author is named after their use of the term Elohim for God. It's where we get the material that encounters revelations and dreams. It's clearly seen in Genesis 12, in that doublet, contrasting the J. It's in the Hagar and Ishmael story in Genesis 20, and in Beersheba as well. E talks about guilt and innocence, and often talks about fearing God. It has no primeval history, so there's no trace of E in the creation narrative. And the first time that we encounter E is in the calling of Abraham in Genesis 15. It mainly talks about 4 people with prophetic traits: Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses. So moving on to P. P is the priestly source. And it was once thought that P started as a polemic against J, and that redactors then put the two of them together. But I think the better idea, more modern scholarship, says that P was an author who looked at the J and E narratives together. So he had both the J text and the E text in his lap, and then somehow revised both of them, adding independent material. So at one point, JE and P were one book together. It's a sweeping enough revision of J and E together that if we had to name one author of the first 5 books, we would call it P. P wrote out of the experience of the Babylonian exile, and he changed the storyline and meaning of the J author to meet the new existential and faith needs of the community. To simply put, the P author's purpose was to restate the tradition of the Yahwistic beliefs, the J beliefs, and to bolster the sagging faith of a disillusioned, defeated, exilic community, one that had been defeated by Babylon, really discouraged, in the face of a superior Babylonian claim about the universal sovereignty of their God. Back then, it was kind of like a football team. Like, you had your God and you cheered for your God. And then when 2 civilizations went to war, it was presumed that the better, more powerful God, which is what was the thing that allowed one civilization to prevail against another. So when Babylon was conquered when Israel was conquered by Babylon, it wasn't just a political statement about the strength of militaries. It was a theological statement about the strength of gods. Babylon looked at that as saying that our God Marduk was more powerful than Yahweh, the God of Judah. So P was resisting or writing against that because it was really hard to believe in a God that was weaker, right? That had lost an important battle. So the P source is really easy to recognize. It features genealogies and dates. It's priestly. It kind of exists to support the priestly profession. So it documents ritual observances. Most of Leviticus, as a result, with all the purity codes, are from the priestly source. And the description of the tabernacle in the Exodus, that's also priestly as well. History for the P author is punctuated by a series of covenants. There are no angels and there are no dreams in P. There are no talking animals in P. So it's really a historical account that justifies the cultic worship of Yahweh. D is pretty clear, the Deuteronomist. It's mainly just the book of Deuteronomy with a little bit sprinkled into other books. It forbids sacrifice outside of the central temple, which is that political move under Josiah to say, all you other little temples, you all don't have any legitimacy, and now you have to travel to Jerusalem and pay us literally money. The money should be collected here, centralized in Jerusalem. And so that's what Deuteronomy does. It kind of outlaws other places of worship. We date D most easily, and that's dated to 621 and the Reform of Josiah. The point here is to know that each author has their distinctive point, and that's important for interpretation. Okay, I gotta hurry up. So Near Eastern context, we have different myths. I'm gonna skip over these myths right now, except for Enuma Elish. It's important to know that this is not something that we knew about until very recently. Only the last 150 years, archaeology has given us these reconstructed texts. that we've been able to translate from Akkadian, from cuneiform, and it's given us the knowledge that now what we know as the Hebrew scriptures emerged out of a much older tradition of these myths about creation, about the gods, that bear a striking resemblance to the Hebrew tradition. And so it's kind of hard for us to say that the Hebrew tradition exists on its own. Our Bible is a unique corpus. It's much more likely that as the Hebrew texts were written, that they borrowed very, very heavily from the cultural milieu of myths, the kind of the common understandings of the surrounding dominant cultures about gods and how they work and how creation works. So Enuma Elish is the one that was going to become important for us. It's the celebration of Marduk, the god of Babylon. It's dated to about 1125 BCE under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar I, because we know that it was only under Nebuchadnezzar that Marduk really became the ascendant god of Babylon. It begins with a creation myth, a primordial pair, Tiamat and Apsu, who represent the fresh waters and the salt waters, the sea. It includes a theogony, begetting of gods, like how do the gods come to be? So many gods were born. And the young gods immediately create a problem. They create a tumult, the noise, essentially, that disturbs Apsu's sleep. And so Apsu proposes to Tiamat that we should kill all these smaller gods because I can't sleep very well. The younger gods learn of the plot and they use a spell to put Apsu to sleep, and they slay Apsu. Another god, Ea, then sets up his dwelling on top of Apsu and forms new gods. One of them is named Marduk. Marduk's toys as a kid are the four winds, and the four winds doesn't have really great control of them, and they disturb Tiamat. And so Tiamat prepares for battle. Marduk kills her and splits her body in two, uses half of her body to create the sky, sets up the stars in it, and uses the other half of the body to contain the waters which Tiamat contained. Then Babylon as a city is created as a house for Marduk, where she resides in the temple of, and the story of the Enuma Elish ends with a banquet where Marduk throws a banquet for all the other gods. Okay, that sounds weird, but we're going to get there. So, what I mentioned earlier is that Genesis is made up of many different accounts. The narrative that we have, Genesis chapter 1 through 2, verse 4a, is considered one consistent passage because it's all written by the priestly source. And it's followed right after by another creation narrative from the J source, the Yahwist source, that we think was actually much older than the priestly source. And so the question is, why are there two creation stories? Why did the priestly writer feel a need to create another narrative? So let's compare the two of them, get some of our answers. So God is Yahweh in the J account, right? Because that's what the J account is named after, the German form of Yahweh, because that is the unique way of addressing God for the J author, whereas in the P account, God is referred to as Elohim. Pre-creation is a dry wasteland in the J account, right? There's no water yet. But in the P account, pre-creation is a watery abyss. In the J account, Yahweh plants Eden and waters Eden, and that's why the wasteland is turned into a paradise. Whereas in the P account, what we have tonight, God creates all things by spoken command. Things come out of nowhere. Yahweh makes animals and humankind by shaping clay. This is the really folksy, Yahweh that we have, like the Far Side comic of God, rolling snakes out of clay. It's a really, really anthropomorphic account. Whereas in the P account, God is much grander, much more transcendent. God creates all things by spoken command. In the J account, God exists, or Yahweh exists as kind of a naive being. So there are many mistakes. Yahweh has to learn things. So, for example, Yahweh creates man, but then Yahweh has to learn that man is lonely. And so woman is created as an afterthought. Whereas in the P account, the creation of women occur at the same time as man. So the thing to learn here is that by contrast, what we're seeing is that P's account of God, of creation, is that it's highly theological. It's very, very careful. And it's not to say that it evolved or that it was, there are no mistakes in P. P is the result of so much evolution of theology beforehand that when P is written, P is just commanding, and it is coherent. It is the representation of an entire collection of thought of several generations, whereas J kind of tries to get through it, but maybe misses the mark sometimes. And so you can kind of see, J is sort of like, for me, like R2D2, kind of like a fun story, but kind of makes some mistakes. Whereas P is the really kind of anal retentive C3PO cleaning up behind and kind of saying like, oh my gosh, I'm really freaking out and making sure that everything's perfect behind the J account, after the J account. So in general, P dismisses many of J's more blatant anthropomorphisms. God plays with clay, God walks in a garden, God discovers human sin accidentally in the J account, but in P, everything is intentional and by command. But God is slightly anthropomorphized in the P account. God still speaks, God sees, God rested. The J account is much more dependent on Atrahasis, which is another Babylonian myth, but the P account borrows much more from the Enuma Elish. And this all scholarship that was done by Herman Gunkel in the 19th century. So let's talk about this passage as in comparison to Enuma Elish. So some comparisons. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk, the god that slays Tiamat, his foe is Tiamat. So something to know about Semitic languages, pay attention to the consonants. Consonants have meaning, the vowels, not as much. So actually, in the Genesis account, the dark pre-created waters that the spirit of God hovers over is Tehom. And Tehom and Tiamat in Semitic languages are actually cognates of each other. So they both have the same enemy. Divine spirit and cosmic matter are both coexistent and co-eternal with God. In the Enuma Elish, we call this the enemy is chaos, and chaos is a Greek concept, but it fits here, so we're going to use it. We normally call this type of trope an ancient combat myth, and the kind of the trope of this myth goes like this: the creator deity has an arch foe, and it's usually a watery monster or a dragon, and they have to battle the dragon, and they slay the dragon, and they use the carcass of the dragon to construct the various parts of the cosmos. And that's really present in Enuma Elish. It's more suppressed in Genesis. Clearly, what we didn't talk about when we read the Genesis account is a battle. And we think that the main reason that the idea of battle was suppressed was because battle invokes polytheism. And the one thing that we know about the Yahwistic cult was that it was monotheistic. But so even if battle is suppressed, still ideas and traces of chaos and that association with dragon and water still exist. And these exist throughout the Bible too. So there are many references. We're confining ourselves to just looking at this one passage, but the comparison, the kind of the revolution of understanding that the Hebrew Bible is heavily dependent on Babylonian myth is a thesis that's supported by many comparisons that extend outside of just Genesis chapter 1. So just know that if this seems really weak to you as an argument, know that it's actually a really, really well-supported argument. And I'm going to go through some of that in just a second. And back to this comparison of Tiamat and Tehom, in Akkadian, Tiamat does mean ocean sea. And so calling Tehom the dark waters, the chaotic waters, it does actually make sense. And creation comes from a division of the primeval ocean and the organizing of that watery mass so that dry land can appear, right? So you have to create out of this chaos. So this is where the combating of chaos has a mythic form, or recognizable mythic form in Genesis. It's also really important here that there is similarity in the creation of different things. But the last thing is really kind of important, that Marduk rests after defeating Tiamat in a temple, and that God rests and sacrifices on the seventh day. And this is actually one of the most important theological links between the two of them, and the most important theological observation in the creation myth that we've got in Genesis chapter 1, because this divine rest. So in ancient Near East thought, temples were not just places where the public worshipped a god. Temples were actually palaces where gods lived, and specifically where they inhabited, where they rested, and where they relaxed. And so the creation of Babylon as a place for the temple of Marduk, where Marduk then throws a banquet and reclines and relaxes, it has a parallel to God resting on the seventh day. And That's because rest is a metaphor for the supremacy of a ruler of heaven and earth, because a deity can only afford to rest when they have no other, and put down their weapons when they have no other foes, when they've succeeded in defeating all of their other, they've succeeded in battle, they've won the combat against chaos. So this is more explicitly what's happening in Genesis chapter 1 when we read some other passages. So for example, Psalm 8 verse 2 says of the Creator, "You built a fortress for your habitation, having silenced your adversaries, the foe and the avenger." So this is referencing the creation myth and making clear that what happened on the seventh day was that God rested, having conquered. So this is where that combat reemerges, even though it was kind of suppressed in Genesis chapter 1. Also, Davidic theology associated the temple on Mount Zion as God's eternal resting place. So we did have that kind of sense even in Jewish cult or the Hebrew cult of God having a resting place here on earth. For example, in Psalm 132, it says, "For Yahweh has chosen Zion, he desired it for his residence." And it quotes Yahweh saying, "This is my resting place, forever here I will reside because I have desired it." So this is a parallel between the two. Going back to the power of the word of the deity, it's noted that in the Enuma Elish story, Marduk controls the destinies, making entities appear and disappear simply by word alone, and God creates out of just verbal command. So that's something that links the two. This goes on further in Jeremiah chapter 31. There's an oracle that says, "Thus has spoken Yahweh, who established the sun and light by day, and orders the moon and stars as light by night, who stills the sea when its waves rage. Yahweh of the heavenly armies is his name." And so that is a pretty clear linking of referencing the creation myth in Genesis chapter 1, sun and lights, moon and stars, to the idea of battle, mentioning the heavenly armies. And also Isaiah chapter 51, 9th, 10, "Awake, awake, arm of the Lord, clothe yourselves with strength. Awake as in primordial days, the primeval generations. Was it not you who cut Rahab to pieces, who pierced the sea dragon? Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great abyss, which is Tehom, who made a road in the depths of the sea so that the redeemed might cross over?" So it's referencing crossing of the Red Sea, of course, in the Exodus, but is more explicitly referencing both the Babylonian creation myth of Enuma Elish, the idea of combat against chaos and the creation coming out of that. So even if Genesis 1 doesn't expressly talk about that, we have to see that, or we kind of get the idea that it was understood by the authors of the day enough that they were able to later on associate Genesis chapter 1 back with the prevalent creation myth, which was just surrounding them on all sides through the other Mesopotamian cultures. Why is that important? Well, let's talk about the goodness of creation. So let's look at a framework of what actually happens. So if we divide this into 6 days, and then knowing that the seventh day was rest, what we can see is that a couple of things. Let's note some different things. First of all, in the 6th day, it's important to note that there is the use of the plural hour. Let's make human in our image, which has been controversial. People have worried, does this suggest polytheism? Were there multiple gods? No, I think actually it just kind of helps to create or to set humans apart, that the creation of human beings was so important that the entire divine firmament had to be consulted. So I just want to note that and put that aside. Note also the emphasis on separation here, that many of these things are created by the separation of light and darkness, the separation of upper waters and lower waters. And this kind of goes back to the priestly kind of obsession with everything being in its proper place. Also note that humankind is noted by the masculine word Adam, which is just the word for human being. It's not actually a name of a person. So, Adam was the first person to the extent that Adam was human, but that wasn't necessarily Adam's name. But also note that in the Genesis account here in chapter 1, male and female are explicitly included together. And it actually led later rabbis to sometimes speculate that the first humans were hermaphrodites, having both female and male parts, which is, very similar to Plato's Symposium as well. But getting back to this diagram that I had here, there are 6 times that the phrase ki tov, how good, are mentioned. Tov, like mazel tov, like mazel tov, good job. And so this leads to a crescendo, on the 7th day when God saw that everything that God had made and said that it was exceedingly good. So this 6 times of the mentioning of ki tov, how good, mimics the 6 days of creation. The problem is, of course, that there are 8 things that are created. And so the author had to push multiple things into a couple of days to kind of create, to mimic the idea, or to mimic the 6 days of work and the 7th day of rest. And so that's why we have, like, on day 3 and day 6, the repetition of many things being created all at the same time. So it has been observed that the way that this is structured in part B, the day 4, 5, and 6, they match up with day 1, 2, and 3, and that we are creating the denizens, like the things that fill the things that were created in the earlier part A. So heavenly lights fill light. Sea creatures, birds specifically fill the firmament. Beasts fill the dry land. Beasts and humans fill the dry land. And that's how this parallel structure is created. So it's also important to note at this point that there are no carnivores, that we are instructed to be vegetarians, and that doesn't change until Genesis chapter 9. Just putting that out there and then putting it on the side. So what does this all mean? This is theology. So the J writer that the J text that had existed beforehand, that was sitting in the priestly writer's lap when the priestly writer wrote this, the priestly writer was reacting to J in some way. And the J writer had conceived of God as originally a naive. I mentioned this. And his initial creation, or God's initial creation, was less than perfect, according to the J writer, because things had to be modified. So the P writer is correcting this by kind of positing a creator that had full awareness of purpose and complete control. Every stage was good and free of flaw. And the one problem, though, is that notice that good is omitted twice: for the firmament, for the heavens in day 2, and also for humans in day 6. And of course, maybe there were 8 acts of creation, and they only wanted to mention how good 6 times. But I think there's a theological message here, and that's that these are the 2 things that were found to not merit being called perfect, because the heavens let the waters of the great abyss flood the earth during the Tehom Rabbah, during the flood story, and humans just in the next chapter sin against God. So these are knowing that because the J text is right in front of the priestly writer, knowing what's going to happen later, the priestly writer foreshadows that by omitting how good for these 2 things. And so this is the way that by foreshadowing that the priestly writer integrated the 2 together. It's interesting that the priestly writer has no account of sin. So never mentions human sin in any of the priestly texts, Genesis chapters 1 through 11. All the sinning actually occurs in the J accounts. So this is not to say that creation was imperfect, because remember that the last affirmation on day 7 was that all creation was exceedingly good. It's instead to kind of suggest that flaws originated in humans themselves, not in the creator. So here the priestly writer was setting up perfection before what the priestly writer knew was coming later, the sinning in the Garden of Eden. So the priestly writer kind of created the idea of a fall by setting up perfection before a fall. And that's actually an inversion of the J story, because the J author kind of posits humanity that starts imperfect and then gradually becomes more perfect. Whereas the priestly writer, by setting up perfection ahead of time, inverts that and says, like, we all started perfect and then fell afterwards. So in the other things to note here, in the ancient Near East, images were important for cultic worship, and the presence of the divine was usually communicated through statues. But no such idols were allowed in the cult of Yahweh. Remember, there's a sort of commandment against that. So for the priestly writer, the note of creating man in the image of God actually functions to reveal the divine image through human beings as a replacement for statuary. It's also important to note that the P version has a command to be fruitful and multiply, which is an affirmation of human sexuality. which is a contrast to the P writer in Leviticus, which generally is being viewed to have a pretty negative view of human sexuality. Also, it's important to note this idea of the divine image and to kind of be really careful about that. It's not a popular thing to say, especially in liberal Christianity, but I would like to suggest that the priestly writer is really only talking about the divine image in the primordial human, in the first humans. It's not as universal statement about human nature. So the P writer was really setting up the point that upon leaving Eden, the divine image was tarnished. It wasn't entirely lost, but it was diminished. And you can agree or disagree with that, fine. But I think that when we're being really kind of accurate to the text, the priestly writer here is really talking about a situation that only existed for the first humans. And we can kind of see that later down in chapter 5, when Adam has children. And in this original chapter 1 account, what it says is that we're created in God's image in the likeness of God. But in chapter 5, when Adam first has children, those two words, likeness and image, are inverted. And so it's noted that Adam's children, that likeness is passed on in the image of Adam, rather than the image of God being passed on in likeness. And so it kind of emphasizes that what we have is a likeness of Adam, not necessarily of God. So we're 2 degrees off from God. And that's really important for the priestly writer. I'm not saying that it's true, it's just important for this priestly writer because, you know, in a cynical and kind of political point, sinfulness is really important for the priestly writer because it sets up the need for a cultic system that will overcome the fallenness of man, right? If you don't have a need for people to come and sacrifice at the temple, then you don't get a lot of sacrifices at the temple. If there's not a lot of sacrifices at the temple, a lot of priests go hungry and unemployed. So this emphasis of the sin of man, of humankind, is really important for someone whose livelihood is dependent on cultic worship and sacrifice at the temple. So it's job security. But this is something that we know today as well. And so we can look at this as a lesson for skepticism today, right? Because think about those pastors that preach most about the sinfulness of people. They oftentimes hold up themselves and their churches as the solution, the mediation, the purification of sinners so that they can encounter a perfect and a holy God. And this is ultimately what leads to the concentration of power for them and their churches. So, you know, we can feel very angry about what happens in the priestly tradition, but then we should be careful about what is happening today as well. I'm at 8 o'clock. That means we're at an hour. I've got 2 more slides. So I'm going to beg your forgiveness and keep going. So I'm going to put this all together and give us some interpretive kind of frameworks for Genesis 1. Like, what is this? What could this all possibly mean? And then I've got one last slide to talk about some application. Here we go. So given that there really are 2 creation stories, we're only talking about one, the priestly creation story, but we know in the back of our heads that this creation story is about to be repeated in Genesis chapter 2, starting verse 4b. So we need to ask, not only what does the text that we have in front of us mean, but also how does it make use of and interact with the older creation story that starts right after this? And why was it even kept at all? Why didn't this, the priestly writer writing after the second story, why didn't he just replace it? Why did we keep 2 creation stories right next to each other? So that's going to be an important question. I think that I would suggest that he wrote this narrative prodded by the need to provide reassurance to a community that was disheartened, that was kind of just despondent from the Babylonian devastation of their world. There was a need at that point in history to affirm the supremacy of Yahweh and to reaffirm the covenant of that the priestly writer had reworked into Israel's primeval myth. So, you know, when Babylon conquers Israel, there are basically 2 problems, right? Either Israel picked the wrong God, right? Because there's a new, more important, more powerful God, Marduk, you know, in the football analogy, that whoever's teams win, you know, worships the stronger God. And we see this with the Baal worshipers with Elijah, that, you know, there's a contest of which priests win and the Baal worshipers die and burn up. So that means that Yahweh is more powerful than Baal. So this is something that we're familiar with. But so either Israel picked the wrong side, and that's why Marduk and Babylon was successful. Or the other problem would be that the covenant between Yahweh and Israel, because Israel had sinned and essentially angered God, was null and void, that God had walked back from the covenant. So either way, there's a big fear that either we picked the wrong God or God has abandoned us. And this is the need that the priestly writer writing after the exile, and we think, of course, that the priestly writer was writing after the exile because the priestly writer shows this incredible depth of knowledge of Babylonian myth, and that probably the priestly writer picked up while living in Babylon during the exile. So the priestly writer has to address these needs of their people. So the goal was to assure the audience that who had survived the Babylonian exile that at their core, their faith in Yahweh was still relevant, while at the same time suggesting alternative ways to imagine that faith, right? Because that faith was written previously in just Yahwistic terms, so that it answered their questions about themselves as a nation and this world that was in chaos without a stable foundation. So that's maybe why chaos is being posited as the enemy, why God rules over chaos, because this world that had just been destroyed, the entire population moved to another country and then moved back, many families scattered, just was chaotic. So the God that was worthy of being worshipped would be the God that could reign over chaos. So there was an attempt to keep the previously established primeval myth from the J author, but place it in this framework of a combat myth that was inherited from the Enuma Elish, from Babylon. And that's because, it was important to kind of change the idea of God from this God who starts out as naive and gradually learns how to make creation work through trial and error. This is not a God that's very powerful, right? This is a God that has to learn about sin, that learns about humanity through the Tower of Babel, through the flood, through the creation of women. That's just always kind of getting it better the next time, but not necessarily always all the time already there. This is not the God that the priestly author wants. Instead, the priestly author posits a God who battles against chaos for the theological emphasis that the world is ruled by an intelligent and an all-powerful creator who would never let the world disintegrate into meaninglessness or succumb to forces of chaos or evil at work in the world. This is the message that's needed by an exilic community reeling from being conquered and scattered. The success of P is kind of measured by the fact that this story is accepted and integrated and still exists today. So by reappropriating the Babylonian myth, the priestly source, kind of subverts the boasts about the supremacy of Marduk and the Babylonian, victory by giving credit for Babylon's victory to Yahweh, by saying that Yahweh is actually still supreme and sovereign, by using the Babylonian kind of story, but making Yahweh the victor. The the creator kind of resting on the seventh day as a climax, it evokes the theological message of all things being under control of the divine sovereign. It guarantees that nothing will happen apart from the divine will. The deity that transforms primordial waters of chaos into an ordered universe by just the power of speaking words is the same deity that proclaims everlasting covenants with Noah and Abraham and with Moses at Sinai. So the remnant of Israel that P was speaking to, who survived exile, they don't need to doubt that they have a future because this is the God that is in control of everything. So by setting conflict with chaos as a historic event, something that happened in history, the priestly source also seemingly kind of foretells the conflict with Babylon by saying that this is a thing that happens from time to time. The dragon of chaos is always lurking just over the horizon. And perhaps the dragon is also lurking within one of its own house, inside of us as well. So it affirms the perfection of the creator's design for the world, but it also acknowledges the awesome presence of evil, which threatens to undo the divine order. And this is kind of the reality that they had to kind of make sense of for the first time, because yes, God is powerful, but really horrible things have happened to them. So the chaos monster, here that we're invoking, it takes on incarnations throughout history as humans do violence to each other and to their world. And anytime humans rebel against the deity. This is how P, the priestly author, uses the older Yahwist myth to reach kind of their conclusion. This is the point of actually why Genesis 1 was written. That God isn't just learning, or God isn't in need of further perfection. It's that there is perfection, and that there is humanity's hubris, and that the things that we see as imperfection in creation are a result of humanity's hubris, not a result of a God that still has to learn more. It's not a result of a God that's still growing. And that's an important thing to be able to reassure people. And, I guess we could also look, if we were looking at Noah as well, the rainbow that happens after the flood. It sort of, it invokes a benevolent creator that watches to preserve an essentially good world. So that the Babylonian dragon, the manifestation of external evil working in the world, doesn't need to be feared, because ultimately God's got things under control. So P has found a way, the priestly source has found a way to meet the needs of the people who, after surviving this disaster, really kind of need a God of universal power. But it kind of means that this is not a story about creation. So even though it's told in the language of creation, I think the better understanding is that this is a story about God. It's a story about resistance and survival. It's a story about questions that kind of, we actually know today that especially here in Hawaii, any diasporic immigrant group, think about what we do when we're separated from wherever our country of origin was. The risk that we face is dilution, cultural assimilation. Our kids stop speaking the original language. So like, I'm a 4th generation Japanese American. So the kids were bilingual, but spoke English. And then the 2nd generation was bilingual. The 3rd generation didn't speak Japanese as a native language. By the time it comes to me, 4th generation, I'm taking Latin in high school. That kind of assimilation of losing culture. So we can understand how important writing Genesis chapter 1 was for this group that was conquered in Babylon, living under a God that was being told was more powerful than their God. They needed some way to resist that. They needed their own creation story where their God was as important, as powerful, and it gave them an identity, a sense of who they were, to be able to resist cultural dilution. And that's really kind of, I think, another important sociological interpretation of Genesis chapter 1, that it's not just theological, it's not just talking about God, but it's talking about the needs of people. And it's a very, very familiar need to us. So I think it's something that, a way that Genesis 1 can actually be more personally meaningful to people here who are immigrants from other places, who have to kind of ask those questions about identity, and how do we transmit identity? How do we tell stories about who we are that preserve our sense of being different in a positive way? Okay. So P, at the end of the day, had the priestly source had the Yahwistic story and the story that they wrote. They didn't consider these two things to be problematic. They're not contradictions. It's not somehow redundant. They're taken to be complementary. And this is not something that we should be problematic with us as Christians, because throughout the New Testament, the same problem exists, right? We have incompatible narratives of the birth of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew and Luke. So we should look at these two things as being complementary and how they work together, and be curious about that. Also to note that I think it would have been really confusing to the author of Genesis chapter 1 if we took this as historical fact. The priestly writer was not trying to write history. Even if there was a literal historical Garden of Eden, we wouldn't, this is not what the priestly writer was talking about. They were not concerned about whether God actually grew hands and modeled clay. What the priestly writer was concerned about was writing about truth that is not contained in fact. Because I think that any writer would have known that this is not possible to be writing about as fact, what happened before the existence of humanity. It's really an 18th century prejudice of ours to think that the only things that are true are preserved as fact. But to writers from before the Common Era, that would have been a completely foreign idea. And people that do think that the only things that are true are fact, those exist both on the scientific skeptic side, as well as on the fundamentalist Christian side, who think that the only way for the Bible to be meaningful is if we treat it as fact, as historical fact. Both of these extreme viewpoints, will not be able to understand the truth that's contained in poetry or art, or in folklore, or in oral stories, oral histories. And that's where the really important, really good stuff is. So I think I want to, if anything, just kind of reassure people that we can let go of needing Genesis chapter 1 to be historical fact and still recover something even more important, which is the meaning of this, which is to understand that this is reassurance about God, that this is reassurance about God's faithfulness, about God being in command, about God affirming things that are good. And that we can always think about other ways to think about creation. That's not just about historical lyricism or literalism. Okay, so I've got some questions to reflect on. First, I guess, is just a reminder that all things being good at creation means that the things that would tarnish the divine image, things like gender subordination, disharmony, violence, are not part of the original goodness of creation. I would add eating meat to that, but I think that that's just probably a bridge too far for us. So we'll just put that out there. So some questions. Is the priestly source describing how the world is made, or guarding the mystery of creation? So is this description or is this mystery? And depending on how we answer that, which better praises God, to know how all things actually work, or to be able to understand the unknowable mystery of God? I don't think the answer is one or the either, by the way. I think it's a really worthy pursuit of science to understand the workings of neutrinos and forces. But at the same time, to think that understanding the world reduces to these things is just as kind of unsatisfactory as to proclaim that everything is nihilistically unknowable. Both, though, are important here. And so, I'd ask then, how does a single-minded focus on perfection silently highlight sinfulness? Because that's what happened here, right? The priestly author spoke so much about it, a perfect God and a perfect creation, that it really set up for the idea of the fall later on in the Yahwistic source in the rest of chapter 2 and 3. And is that really kind of helpful for us to kind of focus so heavily on creation, on perfection, that everything else by comparison is thought to be sinful and dirty? Is there maybe a way that we can be less polarized and see things as being created and be curious about that, but also not judge ourselves so harshly? And then finally, this is going to be the socialist in me. How do we reconcile private property ownership with all of earth being given to all of humankind for sustenance? All the creation, all the seeds, all the trees are given to all of humanity for our sustenance. And yet now today, we carve up the world into parcels of land and price things so that things are inaccessible to some. The extreme forms of this are things like stand your ground laws, where it's now illegal to kill someone because they trespass. So the creation can actually be used, ownership of the creation can be used to kill. And it's kind of ironic that the people that are most likely to support biblically literal readings of this creation narrative, that the world was actually created in 7 days, are oftentimes the people that are most protective of property rights at the same time. And very, very, very strict understandings of these laws of private ownership. So what does creation actually say to us about that? Okay, that's what I've got. I'm sorry for going over, but thank you for your time. And I guess we can talk now. Why don't we stop the recording, Eva?